This episode of Shorr Solutions, the podcast, was originally recorded as a lecture for the Australasian Society of Aesthetic Plastic Surgeons 44th Annual Conference. However, we thought the content was so important, we wanted to make sure you, our loyal podcast listeners, heard it as well.
We are so excited that you are watching, even virtually, even remotely, even though we aren't live and there in person. My name is Mara Shorr, and I am one of the partners here at Shorr Solutions, the other gloriously insightful, handsome, and full of wisdom gentleman that you see on this particular screen is Jay Shorr. And Jay is not only the founding partner of Shorr Solutions, but as we always say, most importantly, Jay is my father. We are absolutely thrilled today to be co-presenting on this topic. Really, we're going to be talking about, I want to make sure I give the exact title, Building a Strong Team, Processes, Protocols, and Working Together Towards Success. We have a few slides for you that, of course, we want to go ahead and include, but most importantly, you're going to get the wisdom that Jay and I bring to the table. So with that, let's go ahead and get started and know that we have nothing to disclose. So Jay, we are going to kick this off with something I think you will be very thrilled to share. Your all-time favorite slide.
Now, let me define why this is a favorite slide. 10 years ago, when I first started the best medical business solutions, Shorr Solutions, and I started creating presentations, this was actually the first slide that I ever created in any presentation. And because of people asking me, like, what is, how to, what are, the typical things that you ask, I felt this was always a great segue to lead into why we believe we do what we do. So with that going forward, let me explain that for those of you that practice all different specialties of medicine, it leads to one common denominator, that medicine is a science. It's a science of anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, and no two people are alike. And that's the beauty of medicine, because it's an ever-evolving science. For those not in the aesthetic cosmetic industry, medicine is a way to heal the sick and injured, because in our aesthetic world, we're not sick. We're not injured. However, sometimes in the plastic surgery world, we may be injured, hence reconstructive plastic surgery and dermatology as well. But for the most part, in the aesthetic side of medicine, it is a way to keep our patients looking young and beautiful. And that is really what aesthetic cosmetic medicine is all about, because with the inception now of integrative medicine from the last maybe 20 years, where it became very popular, not only do we have to look great from the outside, which is the aesthetic cosmetic, but we really need to take care of ourselves from the inside out. And that's diet and that's nutrition. So when you combine the integrative and holistic with the aesthetic and cosmetic, which many people are integrating into their own practices, you feel great because you're healthy from the inside, and you look great because we're helping you look beautiful and young from the outside. As I always say, doesn't your car drive better when it's clean? Medicine is still one of the most respected professions today. Why? Because of the amount of education that you have to have. You go through your now I'm talking about US based, because there are other European models and there are other South American models, there are other Canadian models, and we lecture literally around the world. And there's differences in the educational background in order to become a doctor. Allopathic MD in the US and around the world, osteopathic DO in the US mainly. All right. So it's one of the most respected professions today. And people ask, well, why do you say that? Well, because you need the 4 years of traditional college. Sometimes it can be grouped in a fast track program, which is combined with undergraduate, graduate school, undergraduate medical school in certain countries. Then you do a residency, could be a surgical residency, and then you may do an additional plastic surgery residency. Similar to that of otolaryngology, where you do ear, nose, and throat, and then you do facial reconstructive plastic surgery. All right. And then you go into aesthetic medicine, which then may contain a fellowship in the primary specialty or subspecialty that you want to do. So look at all the education you have to go through, and then you have to go out and get a job. Now, I'm not stating that residency isn't a job, but it's actually part of formalized training before you're physically done, because education is an ongoing and an ever evolving thing that you have to do. And then we always say, after that's all done, medicine is a business, and we have to treat it like the business that it is. Now, I've had doctors argue with me, and they've had conversations and disputes with me. They said, no, we're doctors. It shouldn't be treated like a business. My question then becomes, are you independently employed? Yes. Are you running your practice to be profitable? Well, of course. Do you have a staff and employees? Yes. Do you generate revenue? Yes. Well, if you can give me a different definition of what a business is, then I'm all ears and I'm truly willing to listen. Because if you generated revenue and you didn't generate any profit, would you be in business for long? The answer is no. So then I rest my case, and my closing argument, is medicine's a business, and we need to treat it like the business that it is. Now, I know I try and bring some banter into it. However, as practice management consultants, we work with the operational, administrative, and financial health and guidance of medical practices to increase the profitability of their business. And there's two ways to do it. A, increase revenue, and B, well, there's three ways. A, increase revenue. B, decrease expenses. C is A plus B. All right, so you have to do both. It is much easier to make a profit dollar by reducing expenses, because every dollar that you bring in has fixed and variable costs associated with it, whereas every dollar you reduce is a 100% profit or margin dollar. I like making money by reducing expenses with not having to increase as much labor, because increasing labor is very intense. And production, as long as it's profitable, I don't mind doing it. But I certainly don't ever want to work harder for equal to or less than profit.
And Jay, this brings up a really good point. And honestly, the reason that we are seeing an increase in requests for this conversation that we're going to be having today at conferences internationally, but also in our podcast episodes and really by our clients. And as we are hearing more and more requests for processes and protocols, people have said, I didn't know what I was missing until it was too late. And what we find is that either things slip through the cracks inside a practice, or really the team members, whether they are employees, independent contractors, et cetera, but the people working in and for your practice, they have to work harder and not smarter if there isn't a process and a protocol of how to do something. Now, Jay, I know when you had your practice, you used to even have something about this is how you make coffee in the morning. I think that now everyone pretty much uses the same Keurig in their practices that they use at home. So I think those days aren't necessarily the days of that particular protocol have kind of gone. What is the expression? The way of the dodo?
Yeah, but it wasn't as much how to make the coffee. It's the protocol and the process of who cleans up the coffee pot so that you don't have that burning bottom of the pot smell.
Yes, which went the way of the dodo with the Keurig.
Right.
So there we go. So now that we have unofficially endorsed a Keurig, which we do not, again, no disclosures, we don't work for them. But let's go ahead and have the conversation. Tip number one is an employee handbook, which also includes a staff social media policy. Now, one of the things, Jay, that we talk about often is that the employee handbook needs to be something that everybody sees in a practice, and it's not something that they receive when they first start and then never ever look at again, that we never ever change again. Because Jay, you and I speak with our clients and our team, quite honestly, we're very grateful. We have an amazing team. But with that, we are all having employee benefit conversations, employee compensation conversations. We're having HR issue conversations again and again and again with our clients on a daily basis. And so we are having to update. And I know you also, I'm going to put a tiny list up here. Again, this is just a tiny list of what needs to go into an employee handbook, and the exhaustive list would be incredibly exhaustive. But Jay, you are constantly saying, and I hear we both say this all the time to clients, is that when there is an issue, it could be, like we said, it could be insubordination, theft, dress code issues, name the issue. And you say, well, what does the handbook say? What is the policy when someone is supposed to take a day off? And how do we know that they're a no-show? At what time? Is it when they're 3 minutes late? Is it when they're 20 minutes late? Who are they supposed to contact and how? We go through this all the time. How often, Jay, do you believe that an employee handbook should be updated? And let's talk about some of the best practices as far as what to include in an employee handbook, which is the ultimate process and protocol in your practice.
Well, I want to ensure, because we're speaking to people in Australia and we're speaking to
Yes.
people in other countries, and when it says everything from your state compliant benefits to social media policy, I want to interchangeably use the word state to state slash Commonwealth slash province slash parish.
Yes.
All right, because depending upon where we are around the world, city, state, local, federal policy may all change. However, whatever that word that's interchangeable, synonym to state, use whatever word you want, must be compliant to your physical locality. All right. Now, how often, let's start with question number one. How often do you change it? Well, I think we could say, how often do you review it and change it?
Great point.
Review it should be at least quarterly. And don't assume that it is right, because I don't know how often somebody in your workplace really reviews what federal laws, what state laws, what local, city, state, commonwealth, parish laws may have changed, either minimum wage or health benefit or PTO, paid time off, for that acronym of PTO, and many other things that happen. Look, we just went through COVID. We are still in COVID. I am really tired of hearing that every fault that goes on in the world is COVID. Every fault that went on was COVID, but even though there still is COVID, I'm not poo-pooing that. By now, we should have already had contingency policies in our practice to allow us to move away from that. All right, even though it's still there, mask mandates may still be in place in certain areas, but the businesses, for the most part, are not shut down. I know Australia and New Zealand had some very difficult times that were really succinct to Australia and New Zealand, with visitors coming in from foreign countries, as did Canada. But for the most part, we should have had contingent plans in place already for what happens in the event of, quote unquote, COVID-22, COVID-23, because we keep calling COVID as COVID-19. Mark my words, it may not be COVID, it may not be as bad as COVID, but there is going to be, look, in the United States, we have a monkeypox now. Now, I'm not poo-pooing any of these, by the way. They are real. But the level of how real they are is what we as businesses, because remember, medicine's a business, have to be concerned about, because how large will it get? How detrimental will it get? I ask you to be pleased to be prepared for the unexpected. And as long as you're prepared, if it doesn't happen, you were prepared. I know I live in Florida. When they have a hurricane warning, you can count that depending upon the level, my hurricane shutters go up. I'm preparing for the expected / unexpected. Is it going to be a bad storm? I don't know, but at least I want to prepare, as should you.
So Jay, let's circle back to the employee handbook, and knowing then, and what ties in really well is that not necessarily part of the employee handbook, but knowing that there does need to be those state of emergency processes and protocols. So although we don't have a separate slide for that, but knowing that those state of emergency processes and protocols need to happen.
Oh, let's just create one as we go.
There we go. Let's just start. Let me just whip up the slides. So let everybody just pretend we have a slide for that. We're good. But knowing that some of the things we have seen is that there have been incredible changes in requests for the amount of paid time off that employees are requesting from their practices. We've seen an incredible increase in pay as well. And one thing we want to make sure is that you do in your employee handbook include a technology policy. In other words, when an employee is working from home, or an independent contractor, when they're working from home, what does that technology look like? Ahead, Jay, are you going to grab it? You're going to grab all your technology? There we go. There we go. Hold on, Jay. We'll hold it up at the same time. Ready? There we go.
There you go.
So when an employee is working from home, what is that technology policy in order to make sure that you remain in compliance with, here in the US, we call it HIPAA, but for that protected health information. So we want to make sure that those policies are also in your employee handbook. When we talk about social media policies, we really want to make sure that every team member that has access to the back end of your social media account is well aware of what they are allowed to post, what they are not allowed to post. We truly encourage you to eliminate anything that is political and religious and inflammatory in nature. We are big fans of eliminating those really special, colorful 4-letter words from your marketing campaigns as well. Of course, we have great clients that are just a little more colorful than maybe Jay and I are. So we tend to err more on the side of caution with that.
But it really goes far more than political and religious.
Mm-hmm. It does.
It also should go for sexual preference and sexual orientation. It should get out of race, color, creed, ethnicity. As you can see, and I didn't just put this up just for the sake of this webinar or this presentation that we're doing, but in our company, we employ diverse culture, gender, and it is important that we try to promote who we are as a world, because our client base, our patient base is who we are as a world, and we must be all inclusive. Now, I try not to put personal views into this. I really want to make this professional, but it is important because it's not just what's legal on your social media policy. That will help keep you out of trouble.
Sure.
But it's what's moral and it's what's ethical, which is equally as important. That I don't want any type of the types of element of people that I just mentioned to be bashed. Equal and one for all. And that's how we have to keep our business. Because unless you're going to promote business to the public of only one gender and one race and one culture, you need to make sure that you're clear, concise, and consistent in your marketing and what you allow your staff, people, members, employees to post on social media, so that it's not inflammatory and derogatory to you, for those of you who are the physician/physician owners, practice owners. Because remember, at the end of the day, that business behind here represents Mara and I. That's the Shorr behind the name. Your practice, anything that's inflammatory or derogatory, reflects you and the mission in which you stand on. So when you do it in your employee handbook or a practice handbook, review is one thing. But when you change something, we used to have in the days, depending upon how large your handbook was, you would print it. It's like, oh my goodness, it's 30, 10, 20, 30, 40 pages. And I had 29 staff people. So, imagine the amount of trees we had to cut down to print that.
Tree hater.
I love the cloud. All right. Because we can put everything in the cloud, whether it's OneDrive, whether it's Dropbox, pick your poison. All right. And therefore, when there is a change to be made, we make the change in the master document, save it to a PDF, folks, and only allow the people that are accessing it to access a PDF so that it can't be altered or changed. And then I would send an email or a piece of paper or a sheet of paper to the employee staff with the actual change. All right. Kind of like what you get with a credit card bill, that it says a change's been made and, notice of disclosure. And if you want to see the full thing, here's where you can go. And you give them the link so that they want to print it on their own and kill a tree. That's up to them. But then they can go out and look online and look at the new employee handbook that is version, whatever you want to call it, or REV 082522, however you want to alter the change so that everybody knows the latest and greatest updated and to the minute handbook. And that's what's really important, because it'll define sick days, vacation days, paid time off days, national holidays that you're paying for. It will determine health benefits, healthy living benefits, anything that you're offering outside of an hourly or salary, all right, which I don't post in a handbook, by the way, because each staff member stands on their own. No two, this is, we're not collective bargaining, so we're not governed under unions. So therefore, each employee, we negotiate independently for what their rate of pay, and I want to be fair with benefits. All right, so every staff member is entitled to the same full-time benefits if you're a full-timer or a part-timer, or you can accrue, if you're part-timers, if that's what you want, you can accrue the benefit on a full-time basis, but you're part-time. So if you're giving 40 hours a week off for a PTO, if you're a 40-hour employee, somebody who only works 20 hours a week will only generate in a year 20 hours worth of PTO, because that's all they worked. So when it accrues, you never have to figure anything out. It's an actual.
So, Jay, that's where we wanted to always lead with that one, because knowing that even though it's one slide item, it is such a robust, and there is so much to cover when it comes to an employee handbook. I always encourage everybody watching and listening today, you really want to make sure you have something that is customized to your practice, and make sure that it's customized to the geographic area in which you live, in which you practice. I'm sorry, not where you live. You could live in a completely separate place. So that is very, very true. Yes, we are going to take a slight break, a slight intermission, because what kind of business would we be if we didn't tell you about our own services? I want to take a minute and talk to you about the Conversion Cascade course and all that it has to offer. We want you to be trained to acquire loyal patients and boost your revenue in your aesthetic practice. Now, with our Conversion Cascade online course, you and your team will be able to master 2 key things important to growing your aesthetic practice and becoming successful: acquiring patients and retaining new patients. So let's talk about a couple of things. As a step-by-step sales funnel training, the course is designed specifically to help you and your team attract more patients, convert more calls to consults, convert consults to treatments and procedures, and to keep your patients coming back for more. Not only will our Conversion Cascade course help to strengthen and develop your team's phone and sales skills in order to acquire, convert, and retain loyal patients, it will serve as a valuable onboarding training tool for every new team member that joins your practice. Yes, every new team member that joins your practice. Plus, in the course, you will receive downloadable marketing checklists, phone scripts, conversion tracking tools, and more. So sign up for the course to get started on increasing your revenue and acquiring and retaining new and existing patients. Yes, how to acquire and how to keep them coming back for more. It only takes approximately 4 hours to complete. You can finish it at your own pace and you'll have lifetime access. Yes, that is for the lifetime of the course. And a special thank you for being our podcast listener. We'll give you 20% off. Yes, 20% off. Just enter the discount code podcast. Yes, podcast to start saving now. So click on the link in our show notes to sign up for the Conversion Cascade online course and start acquiring more patients now. Tip 2, want to make sure you have before and after protocols for everything in your practice, from taking the photos. So who takes the photos? How do we take the photos? Where are we storing them? And making sure that there's a written policy on who owns the photos. Now, when I say, Jay, that it is no secret, we have had, oh my goodness, countless conversations, because with the Great Resignation, which I think everybody is getting tired of hearing about it, but it is still in full force. And with the Great Resignation, you have often injectors, non-practice owners that are leaving their practices in which they have been employed and in which they have worked, and they want to take those photos with them. So it then becomes, does the practice and practice owner own the photos, or does the injector own the photos? And what is it that we're supposed to do with that? So that's where we really wanted to make sure there needs to be a protocol, so not only a process for taking those photos, as far as the, was it the octagon, Jay, that we rotate a little more, we rotate again. And so there is obviously a brand name that has done very well as far as supplying these octagons in everybody's before and after photo rooms, but really all you need is an octagon, and a process.
For those of you who are listening and
Yes.
not be familiar, it's a stop sign.
Mhm.
An octagon is a stop sign because
Yes.
they've got, and just for the term, when you're doing that, it allows you to take medial, lateral, oblique,
Mhm.
anterior, posterior photos that are equal every time, that you never have to worry, are they going to be consistent when you're taking the photos, so that each photo before and after will look the same.
Mhm.
And you do it on, if for those of you who don't have one, think of it as a stop sign. And they're going to be all 45-degree angles as you come around, all right? And then you'll stand to the left, the medial, right to the lateral, all right? It's 180 degrees. And this way it's very easy to do.
And we want to make sure that everybody knows not just how to take the photo. So we really, and have a written protocol of how to take the photo, but like we said, how to store the photo. So are those photos being stored on the device on which they're taken, whether that is a digital camera, and that has an SD card? Does it not have an SD card? Is it a digital device, a phone or a tablet that needs to be specifically very high resolution? So not the old model that you got 5 years ago that you no longer want for yourself because the camera is so poor. It needs to be a brand new device that has no other data on it, something that belongs in the practice, in that particular room. Where is this device stored? How do you talk to patients so that they explain if you are taking this on a phone or a tablet? So with that, we want to make sure that we know a lot of photos at this point are being stored in a cloud-based system. and are being stored in your before and after software or in the EMR. So if that's the case, we need to know this. You may very well get patients that give, even if they've signed a written consent, i.e., where are these photos allowed to be posted? Is it for the patient chart only? Are they allowed to post on social media? Are we allowed to post them and use them in print? Are we allowed to post them on the website? So just saying internet doesn't do the trick anymore, because that is so incredibly vague. You could argue, well, Instagram or TikTok, those are apps. That's not the internet. Nobody has any interest in getting into all of that. So we say social media, the practice's website, etc. But we need to know who owns these patient photos. And Jay, can you touch on, before we go into the next protocol, can you give us, Jay, I'm so scared to limit any amount of time on this, but can you give us like a 2 or 3 minute version of how do we know who owns the patient photo of their before and after?
I'll make it real short and sweet. The practice owns the patient and the practice owns the photos.
And how is that, Jay, to be put in writing in that
Well, that
policy?
should be with any provider that you have. That should be in their agreement when they first are hired, whether it is a physician or a physician extender, nurse practitioner, physician assistant, physician associate, whatever, they're being called today. By different states have acknowledged it and some states have not.
Or
Esthetician.
Commonwealth, Jay?
Yeah, of course. And who owns the picture? In a lawsuit, the provider may have access to that picture, but who can take the picture with them?
To use on their own personal
Yeah, it's very
marketing.
important that every time a picture is taken, or a series of pictures, a consent has to be acknowledged by the patient. And it's very important because the acknowledgement from, whether it's the doctor, the medical practice, and or associates, or Mara or Jay, Mara and Jay, once the patient signs it, then you can't be called to task if somebody else uses it that is named in the consent versus I only gave permission to one person. Now it's up to the practice owner to allow the ancillary provider, if you want to allow them to take the picture, fine. But really, ownership is really on the owner of the practice, because an attorney can argue, but for the fact that I came to ABC plastic surgery, that's where I acknowledge and consented that photo remain or belong and never to leave that premises, or for publication, print, or electronic means.
So Jay, I know that you have clearly seen this slide deck before, but whether you remembered that the next thing we're talking about is consents, and more consents, always to be said with that level of enthusiasm. I don't know if you recall, but this is the perfect, beautiful segue. So with that, we need to make sure that we have a consent for every single procedure. We can't say, oh, well, I performed an injectable on this patient 3 years ago, and now we're doing a laser RF device and treatment. Well, they've signed a consent, so therefore we're okay. And we run into things like this often. And we run into questions like this often of how many consents do they need to sign, how often? And we go through this, but what we also want to reiterate is that you need to make sure that that particular patient understands what they are signing. And so I truly encourage, talk to your vendor reps if there's a specific brand, which there likely is, of injectable that you're using, for example, in your practice. Talk to your reps and get those updated consents from them, and also ask them directly for the consent in the language that you are requesting. We have clients that have very high population of patients that prefer to speak Spanish. Some have different dialects when it comes to Chinese, and they have different dialects that they speak. And so we want to make sure that either a translator is provided for them, or the consent is in that language. So we want to make sure that they know what they're consenting. Jay, can you talk a little bit about these points when it comes to, can multiple procedures be combined into one consent? How often should a consent be signed? And well, I talked about where do I get procedural consents, but if you could cover these top two, Jay.
Can multiple procedures be combined into one consent? Anybody can do whatever they want. If the question is, what do
Fair.
I recommend? I recommend that multiple procedures do not be combined into one consent. Let me give you an example. A neuromodulator is not a dermal filler, and a dermal filler is not a dermal filler. One is a volumizer, one could be a filler. Example, one can be a hyaluronic acid type, one could be a polylactic acid. All right. Another one could be a calcium hydroxy. So when we're speaking about it, and they all have different particles, they all have different adverse reactions and contraindications. And what's important about that is if you don't allow the patient to understand adverse reactions and contraindications, what can happen, and they all create different adverse reactions and complications. But if I had known that, this is a patient speaking, I would not have done that procedure. And you threw the consent and you asked them to sign it. And I will tell you that 99% of the people do not read it. I know people get annoyed with me because when they throw something in front of my face to sign, I don't sign it unless I read it. Now, I'm not reading 5 pages, but I will read, or I will ask somebody to point out to me specific things that I want to know. That's for any contract or a consent. So should they? No, they should not. Each type of a procedure, a laser is not a laser, is not a laser. A laser that's going to treat vascular and pigmented lesions, telangiectasias and hemangiomas, are not the same laser that's going to treat laser hair removal. It's not the same RF CO2 assisted device. Understand, they all have different fluency levels. They all can burn differently. One is topical, one is ablative. So don't have one consent because it may not cover everything. And it's never a problem till it's a problem. It's one of my favorite lines. Oh, well, everybody does it. I don't care about anybody else. I care about me. All right. I can go through a stop sign 100 times. It's the 101st time I get caught. All right. But everybody does it that way. Now, how often should a consent be signed? Some people say every 6 months. My office, every time you came in for a procedure, you signed a consent. Why? Because the procedure consent that you're signing for was for allowing me to treat you for this procedure unless your consent otherwise states, and all subsequent procedures. Now, what we did is we had a master consent agreement for each type of a procedure. And then after that, as a supplement, it would have another page with 10 signature lines. So the master consent agreement still stood, but then you then signed it each time on the signature line with a staff witness. And I will tell you what I've heard from certain clients, and they've said, ain't got time for that. All right. No, I do speak proper English, but I don't know if you've ever heard the expression, ain't got time for that. All right. Well, you will have time the second go around when you're called to task by an attorney for any type of a problem and they ask you, where's the consent? We all know the verbiage. If it's not on paper, it didn't exist. Oh, I didn't know that that could happen. And the primary health condition of that patient could have drastically changed from one treatment to another. I don't know whether COVID has anything to do with fillers and with neuromodulators. I've heard there have been some adverse reactions to certain people that have had COVID. Well, let me tell you, I had COVID in June. So if I had a procedure in April and now I'm coming back in August, does the provider need to know I had COVID? Does the provider need to know that a female is pregnant now, but wasn't pregnant before?
Well, and Jay, one of these, this actually, flows really well. I know I say this with every slide, but we have really good timing on this, so I'm going to go with it. So one of the things that I hear so often is, and we call it the other areas of concern checklist, so that patients know what it is, the other services that are available within your practice. And so we call it that because we want to know that, yes, a patient may have come in for one procedure, but we want to know, do they want to learn more about solutions for their dark under eye circles? Are they uncomfortable with their thin lips, their sagging jowls, things like this? Now, what I hear often is that, quite
That they want a
honestly,
Shorr solution.
they do. I always hear this. I'm going to scooch one more slide up, but what I hear so often is that, oh yes, absolutely. We have that. Every new patient signs this and every new patient fills this out. So Jay, based on the example you just gave, think about all the differences that could occur in 6 months. So if a patient was interested in something 6 months ago, their life may have changed and now they're not interested in that anymore, or something happened, they were interested or they weren't interested 6 months ago and now they are. However, fast forward or look at somebody, I will admit, somebody like me, and we will all admit that faces change over time. We know this. This is where our industry comes into play. However, if I've been going to my injector for 5, 6, 7 years now. And I had somebody ask me the other day, well, how long have you been getting your neurotoxin? And I'm always going, wait, I didn't realize it's been this long already, but here we are. Now, my facial structure, my anatomy has changed drastically in the past 7 years. Life is different than it was 7 years ago. So if nobody asked me from the time that I filled something out 7 years ago until now, they're not going to know that I'm interested in other wrinkles on my face, that I might be interested in love handles that have magically since appeared that didn't exist when I was in, maybe 7, 8 years ago plus. So when you have these loyal patients, you really need to make sure you're consistently asking them. And I like to say, ask about every 3 months. So because again, facial structure, body structure, it changes. So that's when it comes to how often should a patient fill this out. And when I also look at include symptoms, not specific brand names of treatments. So instead of saying, are you interested in Botox, Dysport, Xeomin, Jeuveau, Revance, et cetera, pick a brand, right? Instead of asking about that brand name, are you interested in learning more about your forehead wrinkles, dark under eye circles, et cetera? Notice how I talked about it before. So we really want to make sure that that's specifically how we're addressing this to our patient. And finally, this is a document, whether it's electronic or for the paper killers out there, it is something that is still being done on paper if you're still paper chart. This is something that should be worked with and handled by different members of your practice, i.e. your director of first impressions, your receptionist. They should be making sure that the patient fills this out. Your medical assistant should be confirming that all areas are filled out once your patient is in the treatment room. Your provider should be looking at this, talking about some solutions for your patient. Somebody should be putting this information in, and 3 months later, we want to follow back up with the patient on this. This shouldn't just be a document that is, well, we checked that box. We set it and forget it. Now we don't ever have to look at it again. So
That is the power of the upsell because
yes.
medicine is a business.
Exactly. Exactly. And what I want to, I know we've talked about injectables, we've talked about the non-surgical, but in the surgical side, Jay, of which you have pretty incredible, strong experience, we'll say, which and you weren't in the proverbial room this morning when one of the other client success managers on our team and I were saying, well, that's the understatement of the century. We were talking about your knowledge and we said, well, that's the understatement of the century. Of course, there's incredible knowledge there. And knowing your passion for both making sure things are checked off the box and your passion, Jay, for safety as well. Let's skip to the next protocol, which is why there need to be pre-surgical checklists, surgical checklists, and what it is that we need to include on that side. Why are these things important when we have this list here on the screen? So everybody feel free to take a screenshot, but Jay, let's talk about why these things are important.
Well, first of all, there's legal, all right? And you don't want to be missing something when it finally comes time to perform that procedure. Let's go through some of the steps. And I never had this problem in our practice because I ensured that no case ever went to surgery unless I finally signed off on the chart, all right, prior, like 24 to 48 hours at least, before it went back to the OR. We had our own ORs. We had a surgery center plus a medical practices, all right? And when the first important thing is, did the patient pay? All right. We don't perform any surgeries until the patient has paid in full. When you know the
Yes.
money, the ink has dried. All right. That's the first thing. But that's not for safety.
And
That's
we had a
for
conversation with a client that had an issue with this, recently as well. We just had this conversation where even though that patient was someone that they knew incredibly well and they didn't think it'd be a glitch, but it still turns into a glitch where you need to have payment ahead of time and that signed paperwork ahead of time.
all right. So the checklist really consisted of was the H&P done? Is the H&P in the chart? All right. Is there anything that really should be looked at, checked off, highlighted? Was there a medical clearance request sent to a physician? Yes. The date it was sent, did it ever come back? And did it come back the date that it came back, where all of the consent signed? I'm talking about a procedural consent. And if there are combined procedures, example, breast, tummy, lipo, eyes, breasts combined, you have an individual procedure consent on each procedure. And is there an anesthesia consent? All right. All those consents should be signed and put in the chart. And these are check boxes. Example, what size implants? Do you have the implants in stock? Are they earmarked, or do you have to order them if they're not on consignment? Did you order 3? Because 2 go in, 1 goes back, or you keep it for inventory. Did you have foam if you need foam? All right, for whatever. There's certain things. If it's an implant for a mentoplasty, if it's a butt implant, if it's CAB, do you have them? Everything that you're going to need, do you have it already? And if not, is the OR block time booked? Is it confirmed? I can go on and on and on, but everything has to be checked off. And now it came back to me. If I saw something that was not checked, I either made sure to get it or the case was canceled. I never went to surgery wondering whether or not I can get away with something. But this has to be done days before, not the morning of. And I tried never to collect balances the morning of a case. And I know people do this, but I never wanted money to ever be a factor when we're putting a patient to sleep. All right.
I agree.
I want it to
I
be
agree.
a perfectly wonderful example. In addition to, I never brought up any challenging events that were in the practice with the doctor before surgery. I always waited till surgery was over to bring up any, and I mean any, bad news.
And that's, go ahead, Jay. Even what?
Even like it's going to rain today. All right. So seriously, and before each case, I did it the night before surgery. We manually tested the defibrillator. We printed the strip. We put it on the record. I don't want to wake up in the morning, and this happened to me, go test the defibrillator and it doesn't work on the crash cart, and now I have to cancel the case. So, was the case picked? Do all the supplies there? For any of you that want to copy a sample of what a surgery checklist is, just email us. I'll be more than happy to send you a copy of what one looks like. All right. I know many of you probably already have it, but it saves a lot of pain and aggravation later on.
One of the next things, though, is that we divided them out as two separate processes and protocols because is yes, you want the pre-surgery checklist as well as the surgery day checklist. And again, these are checklists, but also processes and protocols and flow. But it's also talking about the post-surgery checklist as well. And so we want to make sure that you don't just have, oh, well, we have one or the other. We want to make sure you have both and that they are separate. So what is that post, and not just necessarily for surgery, but for your non-surgical treatments as well? What are those post-procedure protocols? And
Okay,
so,
so I don't want to mix up post-op instructions
correct.
from post-op checklist. All right. The post-op checklist is the same form as the surgery checklist, but you want to make sure, even on that checklist, that the patient has been given pre-op, post-op instructions. They have a caretaker to take them home, the name and the phone number of the caretaker that's taking them home, and that they speak the language of your country. All right. So that you're not having somebody that doesn't speak the language also of the patient that's taking them home. All right. And then you want to make sure that you review the chart afterwards. Why? Because many documents need to be signed by the anesthesiologist. They need to be signed by the doctor. You want to make sure that the patient has been called the night of the surgery to check in on them. That's one of the blocks on the checklist. That the anesthesia form, the graft form, the drugs have been totaled. You don't want to miss a block. Now, let's get to the post-op notes, the procedural. What does a patient do post-op? Ice to reduce swelling, drains, bandages. You want to let them know, if you're doing a laser, that if their face looks like a red fire engine, it's a matter of concern, but we always used to say that means you're going to get a great result. You know, you want to make sure that you have advised the patient and any caretaker what to look for, bleeding, oozing, and to contact you right away if something is abnormal, because you need to share with the patient what is normal, because people are very concerned. If somebody tells me, Jay, you're going to have this and you're going to have that, and you're going to have pain that radiates from here to here. If I have that oozing that's yellow, and I have the sputum, and I have whatever, and I have this, but you've told me ahead of time that this is normal, I won't freak out. It's like the sniffles and the colds that you had, that your first baby has. You as a parent, when your first child has this, you're on the phone with the pediatrician. By the second and the third second and third baby, you don't even call the doctor anymore.
To be fair, Jay, I still call you with those things. And I'm almost 40 years old. So that I don't think that I'm sorry, Jay, that's just how that's always going to be. But having those things are going to be incredibly important. You want to make sure that you have all of this in writing to give to the patient, and that your team member is really able to go over with that patient as well.
And the patient has signed, and you have a witness, because you want to ensure that you have a receipt, that they've acknowledged receipt of those, and you want to have a witness in there that they were there when it was signed.
And Jay, that goes under consents, and more consents. So without us backing into that slide, that's where that falls now, to go completely on the opposite side of the patient care. But equally delightful to talk about, especially if you are Jay with his glorious math brain. So you want to make sure that you have budget spreadsheets. So, and again, I'm going to click forward here because these are just a few, and Jay could probably talk to you all week about numbers, the need for having all of these, not just because you want to have them when times are good, but because we see clients come to us all the time when things go horribly, horribly awry, and they haven't had proper profit and loss statement analyses. They haven't looked at their procedural costs. They don't know what all of this looks like. And so they come to us once things have gone wrong. And then Jay gets to spend an incredible amount of time trying to really dive in and recategorize things versus knowing that we've been able to set this up correctly from the start. So I think having these budget spreadsheets is going to be just incredibly, incredibly important. So
The most important part about the budget spreadsheet of what a procedure costs is so that you know that you're pricing it properly. Don't price it what the market necessarily bears from your competitor. They may be able to get a better price for a consumable or a disposable or an implant because not every plastic surgeon pays the same fee for an implant, right? So you may be able to make more profit margin by a lower expense cost. All right. I knew to the penny what every case cost that we took to the OR because I was able to chart milligram per kilogram. I was able to chart each peel pack, every liter of oxygen, everything, the needle holder, everything went on a spreadsheet that I created. And as long as the data is entered properly, you then just have to enter manually the labor of what it cost you physically in the OR. And then it'll tell you as a recap what it cost. You put what you charge and it tells you what your net profit was.
So with that, I'm gonna keep going to a different topic. This is the part where we jump around just a little bit here, but as we start to wrap up our list, we want to make sure that you are holding in your office regular team meetings and that we aren't holding them once a year or holding them at random without any agenda. We are big fans of agendas here, and we like to go into a meeting with an agenda. Jay and I often, and if not always, we'll have an agenda even when we meet as well. We want to make sure everything is being covered. So we want to think about not only that, but having productive meetings on an ongoing regular basis and not just when something goes wrong. We want to make sure that you have regular huddles with your team. I encourage a weekly meeting. It doesn't have to be that it's the entire team that meets every week, but it could be front office, back office, just surgery center, just clinical, all team, et cetera. And we break it up that way. So that is something that we do want to make sure we're not letting fall to the wayside. And you want to make sure that you incorporate into those regular meetings things like training. So it could be that 1 week or one time for the all team meeting, that is when you have training that quite honestly, your vendors are going to be more than happy to provide. You want to look at tip number 9, and I'm gonna fly on through here, Jay. So tip number 9 is not something that you're hearing about with us from the first time, but we are talking about making sure that we have strong and fair compensation plans, but we need to make sure that we're analyzing those by the numbers. Now, of course, you have listened to tip number 7 when it comes about budget spreadsheets, and you are really getting to get your hands in and get your hands dirty with those budget spreadsheets, but you want to make sure that you're making those decisions about how to pay your team based on production and based on the numbers that are actually available to you through your practice management software. Because otherwise, now, Jay, we've seen quite honestly more and more lately where a provider will come to a practice manager or practice owner. Sometimes it's 30 or 60 days after they've started and they want more money right away. And so that quite honestly is not a sustainable model to give your team raises every 30 days. So we know that that is not something that's feasible. So making sure that you're really using incentive programs, make sure that those incentive programs also are bonus versus commission, depending on what your state, province, Commonwealth, CJ, I don't forget about the Commonwealths every time. I'm remembering to talk about them. Or country, looking at what it is that you are allowed. Are you allowed to provide commission, or does it need to be a bonus structure? Making sure that you have those KPIs included, those key performance indicators.
In addition to that, you also want to know how much are you generating per provider per room. Because if you don't know how much you're generating, now look, we know that a surgeon should be generating $2,000 to $3,000 an hour in that OR. A provider should be generating $1,000 an hour in a room.
Yep, exactly. And knowing this information is incredibly important. It's incredibly important. Tip number 10, and this is the last one. And this is where I didn't check with Jay ahead of time, but I'm going to go ahead and offer something to everybody that is listening, a business associate agreement here in the United States. Any vendor that you work with that could possibly have access to your protected health patient information and their protected health information really needs to sign a business associate agreement. So if you do not have one you already use in your practice, please go ahead and email us. We would be more than happy to provide that at no charge, no financial investment, not a charge, but an investment, because we want to make sure that you are truly covered. And with that, and with the business associate agreement, we talked about who should sign one, what is it for? It's the protection of the patient health information, and then keeping those available in Dropbox in OneDrive. So with that, Jay, we have managed to get through in 60 minutes, almost to a T, we have managed to get through processes and protocols.
I'm going to miss all of you.
So with that, if you have any additional questions, to those of you watching, if you have any additional questions, please feel free to schedule a free 30-minute consult. You are welcome to listen to our podcast, and you have the information below about how to reach us. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you so much.